especially thank my good friends, mezzo-soprano Simona Jenga and pianist Joel Goodfellow, because they've been friends for many years, and I am very grateful to them that they are here and helping me make this lecture recital happen tonight. So without further ado, I would like to begin by asking a simple question. When you think of an operatic voice, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And I'm going to change my mic, sorry. I've asked some of my friends that aren't into like classical music necessarily, and usually the answer is like a big voice, they emulate this big voice with a big vibrato, which I mean they aren't wrong necessarily. And when I ask people that are into opera or like classical music, the first thing that they think is of vocal categories, and the vocal categories that usually come to mind is usually your soprano, mezzo-soprano, tenor, baritone, or bass. And I find this next slide pretty funny. I run across this cartoon, when I was in my undergrad walking the hallways of the Faculty of Music at the University of Lethbridge. And one of our faculty members had it posted in their door. And I just thought it was really funny, that they had these ideas of what each voice is thinking about, what each one of these singers thinks about. I don't know that it's real, I don't know that it's true, but it is true that there is a set of expectations with each one of these voices, and more often than not, there's not just a musical expectation, an emotional expectation, a dramatic expectation, right? But we have already assigned specific roles to each one of these voices in our heads. So whenever we think of a soprano, we more often than not think of a heroine, a young princess. If we think about a baritone, we think sometimes about the villain, the antagonist. The bass, we usually think, oh, that's the old wise man, that's why he sings so low. And oh, there it is. And then when we think about the tenor, we think again about the hero, about the romantic lead in the opera. And the mezzo-soprano complicates things a little bit, but we can still sort of always have a role in mind. It's always like an older, wise lady, or sometimes plays this duality, playing young voice like in Mozart's, like Cherubino, where they use the trouser rolls. So it's a little bit dubious, but we still kind of have something in mind, right? I don't think that that's necessarily good, but there's a reason why we have these expectations in mind, and it's because of what we've been taught to listen, or what the majority of the operas that we listen to utilizes these voices in those roles, right? However, there's a voice that kind of comes and complicates things, and that's that of the countertenor. I don't know how many of you have heard a countertenor before. I imagine most of you, and I know that some of you are my friends, so you have at least heard me sing. But the first reaction that one gets when one hears a countertenor is often that one of a little bit of shock. You're like, I don't know how I feel. Like, first of all, it's like, where's this sound coming from? What is that sound? And then I guess the most important is, how do I feel about it? And nowadays, the countertenor voice is more normalized, which is great. But it wasn't the case for many, many years, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I have to say that even, I'm going to age myself, but even 18 years ago that I started my undergrad, to see a countertenor on a drop list of an audition or competition was very unusual. You wouldn't see a countertenor in a lot of places. They wouldn't necessarily know what a countertenor was. And again, we have to set the voice depending on where we are, right? Because in Canada and in the US, I feel like there's been more acceptance, as well as in Europe. But in other countries, I've talked to colleagues and friends of mine in Mexico, and the countertenor voice is not something that is necessarily, even to this day, received in the best of ways. Sometimes it's like, why is that guy singing in that upper high register? To the point that there's been a colleague of mine, in his dissertation for the University of Mexico, took the time to write the story about a guy that was kicked out of like a church ceremony where he was performing, just because he was performing as a countertenor, right? So the way we hear the countertenor voice is different, is unusual, and this is something that performers, composers, and everyone have sort of question, well, where does this voice fit? And there's been quite an evolution that I'll be happy to share with you tonight in this lecture. But in order to talk about why it's not common to hear, and why it wasn't very common to hear a male sing up in his high voice, we have to sort of look back a little bit at history. And I'm going to take you back to just the 17th and 18th century. And during this time, the high voice on the stages, it was very much normalized. We had the castrati, and for the people that don't know what a castrati was, I'll do a very brief sort of introduction. I cannot give a lecture on the castrati because that would take us a few hours, and we don't want to be here till midnight, or probably several lectures, to understand the cultural impact that they had. But the castrati were these singers, that were, as the name says, young boys that were castrated before puberty in order to be able to keep their high voices. Why did this happen? Well, there was many reasons. The majority of them were in the church settings, were religious, of course. Women weren't allowed to take part of any of the services or sing in any of the choral groups. In theater, women weren't allowed to be in theater, right? So then they started this practice. And when they realized the capabilities of a castrati in terms of the vocal abilities, they were like, well, this is something incredible, right? Because what is interesting is that the castrati would keep their high register, however, their whole body would obviously grow. And not only grow to be that one of an adult male, but it had specific characteristics because the growth hormone comes from there, right? And it's controlled there. So some accounts say that castrati were actually quite tall, very tall, wide in the hips. Some of them have breasts, and extremely big lung capacity that allow them to sing sometimes lines that were, there's tales that say that some of these castrati could sing up to 2 minutes without taking a breath. So some of the most famous composers at the time, which we have like Handel, Gluck, Monteverdi, even Mozart in his early stages, wrote for these voices some of the most difficult and virtuosic music. But they weren't seen as strange, If anything, they were sort of related and seen by society as these heroic figures, at this, they were usually playing heroes in operas, and they were seen as the stars, really the rock stars of the time. However, in the 19th century, there was disappearance of the castrati from the stage. Why? Well, there were many reasons, thankfully. A lot of it had to do with human rights and with new discoveries in terms of scientific and medical discoveries. And also, the whole Industrial Revolution took place, which made that they needed to have clear activities for each one of the genders. And that was when the low voice was associated then to male, and the high voice exclusively to female. Does that mean that the high-pitched voice disappeared completely? No, it didn't. They were still singers that sang in their falsetto, mostly known as falsettists, that would perform in choirs and ensembles in churches singing the alto lines. However, their voices weren't trained to be soloistic, they weren't performing any solo work. And in the operatic stage, they definitely completely vanished. And composers started writing now in a different style, more virtuosic, well, not more virtuosic than the Baroque necessarily, in a different way, but for mostly tenors and sopranos, and these high voices sort of disappeared, right? And so it wasn't until this man, Alfred Deller. Alfred Deller was born in 1912, and he was a young boy singing in alto lines in an Anglican church. And as he grew, older, his voice started developing a little bit more. And with his ensemble, the Deller Consort, he started reviving some early music. And he started singing it as a countertenor. And of course, this at the beginning was a little shocking. People also didn't know how to react to it. But, he embraced sort of the difference. He didn't try to normalize the voice. He didn't try to tell people, well, this is normal. However, he wanted to sort of embrace that difference in his voice and said, well, there is a reason why I'm performing like this, and it's because this is the historical practice. And so at the same time, I started this interest in the musical world, to start bringing back some of these historical practices, to playing historical instruments, and so the voice kind of fitted well. People weren't questioning necessarily, why is this man singing high? It was like, okay, he sings high, but he's singing this old music, right? To which, to an extent, we have to thank Alfred Deller for this emergence of what I call the modern countertenor. Because when we think about it, it's, and some scholars even have mentioned that, the countertenors came to replace the castrati, and I don't think that's fair for either of those parties, right? Because the castrati went through a whole surgical procedure, to preserve their high voice. Countertenors didn't do that, right? So to me, it's a whole separate world. And here I have to agree a little bit with what Laura DiMarco, a scholar, says in one of her publications, where she says, well, it is unfair, that, or it's not right to say that countertenors come to replace the castrati, because if we wanted to get closer to what a castrati sound was, we would have to listen more to a soprano. Because the reality is that young boys and girls, before they go through puberty, they have a very similar sounding voice. And I'm sure you have experienced that whenever you call somebody, and a little boy or a little girl answer the phone, it's hard to tell if it's a boy or a girl, right? So she said, well, if these boys didn't go through their voice change, probably the most similar sound that we would equate to that of the castrati would have to be that of the soprano. However, why have some scholars and people say, well, the countertenor came to replace it? Well, because with Alfred Deller, what happened is what the voice, and again, don't get me wrong, we're thankful that he brought the voice back onto the stage, but it was confined to the past. It was confined to performing exclusively early music, Baroque music. So people sort of understood it and they were okay with the voice if the voice kind of stayed in that box. That has been changing, and I will discuss this further. However, it's still, surprisingly, the most common idea of people. Whenever they hear a countertenor or they see a countertenor, and I've experienced this myself many, many times, whenever I meet someone and they ask me, oh, what voice type are you? And I'm like, I'm a countertenor. So the first thing is like, oh, that's rare. And the next thing is like, oh, you must sing a lot of Baroque music, right? You must sing a lot of early music stuff. And my response is, some, however, I've been doing more of the contemporary work. Oh, really? There is? And then we have to go through this whole explanation, right? But the reality is that a lot of countertenors have been always boxed into performing early music, and even to this day. And assume that if you're a countertenor, you're going to be performing only Baroque music or early music. So, nonetheless, Alfred Deller brought this voice sort of back, not normalizing it, but sort of brought it back. And there was this person that came to sort of change the game. This composer came to change the game because he heard the voice and he said, it's interesting, I like the sound, but where can I use it? Where can we use the differences of this voice? And that was Benjamin Britten. And Benjamin Britten came and wrote the opera A Midsummer Night's Dream, based on the Shakespeare play. And he decided to use the countertenor voice. And here I correct myself, not necessarily the countertenor voice, because he was using Deller, Alfred Deller, because at that time he was the only one. So there was really nobody else there there wasn't a whole category of countertenor. He knew Alfred Deller. So for Deller, he heard the voice and he said, well, it feels like this voice would go great as the role of Oberon. And that is amazing. We are very glad, and I am very, very thankful to Britten, for bringing the countertenor voice onto the operatic stage. That's something that we are very grateful for. I'm sure all countertenors, right? But there was one thing that he sort of did, and he sort of made an archetype for the voice, because he gave the countertenor the role of Oberon. Oberon being the king of the fairies. Oberon being not human, right? Because he said, well, the voice has certain qualities. How can we make these qualities work and they will be well received if we create them and we put them in a whole different sort of world, right? And it's amazing. I'm going to do a little example of the aria, and it's amazing what he does with the voice and the fact that he brings it into the main operatic stage in the premiere of the work in 1960. However, again, rather than what he's wanting to do is he wanted to incorporate this voice, but he's trying to distancing it from sort of the human part. Because that way, and I'm sure it wasn't intentional, what he was doing was great, was bringing the voice back. But, he wanted the audiences to be sort of okay, to understand that this voice belonged in this other world, right? So, As we look at the score and how the way he scores and the orchestration, we won't be able to hear that tonight, unfortunately, because we only have a piano, although Joel Goodfellow is amazing at creating different colors, but we don't have the orchestration, we don't have the use of the celesta that he uses, to create this kind of shimmering world. However, you can still be able to pick a lot of these elements in the music, and it's floating lines, scalar motion, very light orchestration, because again, it was to the service for both reasons. One was to service specifically the voice of Alfred Deller, because that's what he had, sort of an example in terms of range and in terms of power and volume in the voice, and also because this, by not really grounding the voice, it also makes it feel like it belongs in a different place. And I do invite you, if you get a chance, to listen to the whole opera, because you will be able to hear how there's two complete different sound worlds that he creates. One where the human characters belong, and one where all these fairies and the countertenor voice belongs within the opera. Sorry. So without further ado, I would like to invite my pianist and friend, Joel Goodfellow, to come up so that we can perform the first musical example of tonight, which is the aria I Know a Bank from the opera A Midsummer's Night's Dream, where Oberon sings to his little helper, to Puck, to his little minion, asking him if he managed to find this magical flower that has this magical substance that he will be placing in the eyes of Titania and of the Athenian people, and is what it starts this whole kerfuffle that takes place in the opera later on. So I hope you enjoy. I hope that you were able to pick up on some of the ideas that I was mentioning, you know, the flowing lines, the scalar motion, the piano, to sort of really create a whole different world. Again, it's more contrasting when you're able to listen to the whole opera and you really get to feel these two different and separate worlds. So, however, as I mentioned, Britten does a wonderful thing, you know, and he for the first time puts the countertenor voice on the operatic stage. And I say, again, for the first time, because it's the first time we're hearing this, the countertenor sound being performed in a major opera, which was about 66 years ago, right? However, with this archetype that I was saying, where he positions the voice for this kind of unusual and non-human characters, is sort of the practice and later on other composers sort of take on, you know, and we can see it in some of the operas that came later on, like Death in Venice by him, where the countertenor sings the role of Apollo, Akhenaten by Philip Glass, where again, even though Akhenaten the pharaoh was human and was a historical figure, the music and the way it's said, it pulls him completely away from the rest of the other characters. And Written on Skin, for example, too, by George Benjamin, where again the countertenor plays the role of like Boy One or Angel One, which is again this sort of creature that doesn't belong within the rest of the opera. So now let's transition 66 years to the most sort of recent opera that utilizes a countertenor for a major role. And this is the opera El último sueño de Frida y Diego, The Last Dream of Frida and Diego. And I chose this opera, well, for a couple of reasons. You know, one is obviously I am unaware, and I apologize, you know, if there are some other opera that utilizes a countertenor that is currently being performed at maybe a smaller opera house. But this opera right now that features a countertenor in a major role is being premiered at the Metropolitan Opera, you know. So, and the second reason is I was very close to how this opera came to be because I was invited to the first workshop in 2019 in Fort Worth, Texas. You know, so I saw how the music and the opera itself evolved, and then I was able to also do one of the shows in 2024 in Omaha, Nebraska. And with Gabriela Lena Franks in El último sueño de Frida y Diego, we see a profound transformation of the usage of the countertenor voice. However, in order to understand it, I need to sort of situate you first within the context of the opera. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to tell you about the opera. So the opera takes place on Dia de los Muertos, which is a very important celebration in Mexico that takes place on November 1st and 2nd. And it happens in 1957. A few years, 3 years after Frida's passing. And at this point, a very sick, a very ill Diego Rivera is hoping to have one last meet with Frida Kahlo and have her sort of help him ease the way into the world of the dead. Through some sort of magical help, you know, there comes the figure of Katrina. And Katrina is, and I'm sure some of you have seen it, is this kind of like skeleton, the calavera, you know, dressed with fancy clothes, which is a very important element in the folklore of Mexico. You know, it was from the etchings of the artist Jose Guadalupe Posadas, you know, and later was used by Diego Rivera in one of his famous murals. And Nilo Cruz and Gabriela use this figure to sort of represent the gatekeeper or the keeper of dead. Although there's a little bit of reference to Mictlantecuhtli, who was the god of the dead for the Aztecs. But they use this figure because, again, it's known in popular folklore. And she is the one that sort of gives Frida the opportunity to go back for 24 hours to the world of the living and to see Diego, however, under one condition. And here the librettist takes a little bit of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, because it's like you can come back to the world of the living, and tells Frida, you can come back to the world of the living for 24 hours as long as you don't make any physical contact with Diego. If you make any physical contact with Diego, what will happen is that you will relive the pain that you had to endure when you were alive, right? And as we know, Frida Kahlo lived a very tumultuous life, you know, due to all the accidents that she had. Right, so to this, Frida answers and says, no, I don't want to go back. I have no interest at all in going back, right? But, and here is where the character of Leonardo, which is the countertenor, comes into place, you know? Leonardo happens to be this ghost of an actor that is rehearsing the lines from the movie Queen Cristina. And Frida Kahlo comes into this room and sees him rehearsing, and he comes, and it's important to mention, Leonardo doesn't appear as sort of a symbol. He sort of performs himself into the stage. He comes and he's performing these lines when Frida sees him and asks him, I recognize the lines. Those lines are from the movie Queen Christina. And Leonardo responds and says, yes, do you know the movie? And she, of course, they go into this interaction of saying yes. And he's like, but why are you trying why are you playing these lines? Why are you rehearsing these lines? And Leonardo says, well, back in the world of the living, there is this man who is a huge admirer of Greta Garbo. And I want to cross into the world of the living and go visit him. And then she goes like, but Greta Garbo is not dead, because this is 1957. Greta Garbo was still very much alive. But he says, yeah, but his admirer does not know that. So I'm going to take that opportunity that he's asking for her, and I'm going to cross to the world of the living and visit him. But then he says, the real reason why I want to go back is because I want to have the opportunity of being alive again and of enjoying my life, my career as a performer, my art. And this is sort of the trigger that makes Frida Kahlo later on decide that she will come back. And she will come back not because of the pain, but she will come back to relive the beautiful things that she lived, to the culture and to her art, And this is all because of Leonardo, because Leonardo then later sings an aria, which I'll be singing for you tonight, and basically convinces her to go back to this world. So this is interesting because for some of you, and I imagine even it was for me at the beginning, when I was first given the score and told what Leonardo was, I was like, well, it's 66 years later, and Leonardo, the countertenor, is still a ghost, is personified as a woman. We're still separating these two worlds very clearly. However, when looking more in depth at the work and when talking to dear friend Gabriela Lina Frank, the composer, and Nilo Cruz, the librettist, it was clear to me that the different thing here that they wanted to do with the character is that they didn't want to distance him from the world. They didn't want to distance him from the human world. They wanted to bring him in. And it is different because in this moment, the countertenor, Leonardo, is living in the same world as these historical figures that existed, He's living in the same world as Frida, and at some point he's in the same world as Diego, He goes across back and forth, which again, it's great the way it works, because for us, for the Mexican culture, the Day of the Dead, that's what symbolizes, it's kind of that passage between being able for those couple of days to have our spirits, or the spirits of the people that have passed, come to visit us. So Leonardo this time, it's not an outsider, but it's there. And talking to Nilo Cruz and to Gabriela Lina Frank, they made special reference to the fact that they don't want Leonardo to be seen exclusively as a symbol, They want people to see him as human. And that is very important. And I dare say, like Nilo Cruz in his writings on the script, he asks that when Leonardo comes out, he'll be only wearing a silk robe, So he tries to push this boundary a little bit further, where so that people can really get a sense that he is a performer, that he's an actor. In both productions, the one that I was part of, where you can see a picture there, that one and the one currently at the Met, and again, that's up to the production, whoever decides how they are going to approach the opera. I think they take it, and Nilo, when speaking with him, he wasn't necessarily, he was happy with the way they were doing it, but he was like, I feel like I would have approached differently the way they did Leonardo, right? Because I didn't want him in costume. I didn't want him to be fully in drag, And this one was a little more sort of fluid. The one at the Met is full on drag. However, I still feel like they've been really cautious with the way they approach the role, in the sense that they are not making a caricature of it. And I think that's very important and very relevant, because again, it's not using the countertenor voice to sort of voice this drag image, right? It's more the performance aspect.
And what is key is what we see in the music, right? The music, even though Gabriela Lina Frank still utilizes some of the language of Britain, because Britain influenced a lot of the composers that wrote, and is still influencing a lot of the composers that write music for countertenors. Gabriela Lina Frank also uses, the scalar motions, the floating lines. However, what she's trying to do is, rather than creating distance like Britain did of two separate worlds, she's trying to create immediacy. She's bringing Leonardo into the world of Frida Kahlo. And you can see that because, again, if you get a chance, which I really recommend if you can listen to the full opera, and I'll do a little bit of advertising, but it will be playing, I think, this weekend and in a couple of weekends also at Cineplex. You'll be able to hear the whole production from the Met. You'll be able to hear that this music comes back, but it doesn't come back only with Leonardo. There's sort of a little bit of a leitmotif that constantly comes back when Leonardo is on stage, but it is also later on used by the Fridas, who borrow the same melody. And I feel like that's very important because it's integrating the countertenor voice into the whole world of opera rather than trying to distance in this voice. Another very important thing that Gabriela does is Gabriela is no longer writing for a specific voice like Britain was. She's no longer writing for a specific sound in mind, but she's now truly writing for the countertenor tessitura, right? And the way she does this is brilliantly, because just like I spoke before with the categories, with all the other vocal categories we've always had, like I said, sopranos, mezzo-sopranos, but within each one of those voices and registers, we still have other categories, right? We know that if a soprano has a really big voice, she's possibly a Wagnerian soprano. If a soprano has a lighter voice and ability for a lot of coloratura, then it's a light coloratura soprano. We have all these different sort of names and facts that we give singers. Not that I think they are necessarily helpful, but sometimes they are useful. And for the countertenor, there's no such thing, because being such a new voice, having heard the countertenors for the past, 60 years, and the way the countertenor voice has evolved, because before there weren't too many, now every time there's more, and they're nurturing their voices at a younger age, and they're able to do much more difficult and virtuosic things that they were before. These changes, and Gabriela is aware of this. I was very fortunate to be invited to teach a seminar on the countertenor voice for her academy, for the Gabriela Lina Frank Academy of Music. And when I was teaching, she sort of came to the realization, you not all sound the same. Each countertenor has its own sort of strengths. Some have the lower register, some have a little bit more of the higher register, some can do it all. And in order to really accommodate all countertenors and make sure the countertenors could perform this role, what she did is she gave different options within the score. And I know it's tiny, but you'll be able to see that she has a couple of options, in some of the lines, so that a countertenor can use whichever line they feel more comfortable. And even after that, she still gives the performers some sort of agency, because she's been so close to all of these performances that she'll be sitting with a countertenor and saying, what feels comfortable? What can you do? What can you not do? There's been so far 4 countertenors that have taken on this role, and we've all done it very differently. There's the ones that have stronger lower register, and she's adjusted certain things. There's the ones that have a very beautiful upper register, and then there's ones like Kamon Murray, who I had the chance to talk with him about the opera, and he's somebody that has beautiful high notes as well as crazy low notes, So for him, he said, I talked to Gabriela and I asked her, can I sing the high A, and float it? Sure, if you can do it, go ahead and do it. And that again shows a lot of advancement, but also shows the level of collaboration of performer agency that she's wanting to give performers in order to make this music their own. So without further ado, I would like to now invite my colleagues, Simona and Joel, to come. We're going to perform 3 little excerpts from the opera. They are short. The first one is the first interaction that Leonardo has with Frida Kahlo, where they are discussing the movie and the fact that he's acting. Secondly, is going to be the aria that Leonardo sings to Frida, trying to convince her to go back to the world of the living for her art. And then lastly, we're going to do a very small excerpt from the second act, which is when Frida and Leonardo encounter each other in the world of the living. And that's where Frida asked Leonardo if he was able to see the Greta Garbo's admirer. And he responds that he was. And here, Gabriela uses also another feature. She has the countertenor sing down the octave to emulate the voice of the admirer, which again is very effective and sort of gives us a sense that what's truly Leonardo, it's a performer.
shall leave a great in this room. Bravo, bravo. Sabes quién es Greta Garbo. La vi en la película. Quisiera visitar a un admirador de la actriz. Así, todos los años la espera. Él cree que está muerta. Clara Garbo nunca ha venido a verlo.
So again, I just want to thank Simona for being part of this, singing the role of Frida, and I hope you're able to hear some of the qualities, some of the qualities from Britain, that got carried over, but again, how Gabriela Lina Frank here is trying to bring more immediacy, to bring the voice and the countertenor into the same realm as all the other characters in the opera. So now I will let you rest for 10 minutes for a brief intermission, and then we'll come back for a shorter section of the lecture recital where I'll be performing some other music now in the realm of art song. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. So for this next half of the program, I want to talk a little bit about our art song, and I won't go into as much detail as with the countertenor and the operatic stage. You know, I hope I was able to convey the idea of where the countertenor has gone, you know, in the past sort of 66 years since its emergence till where it's now. But countertenors have also had to sort of struggle when looking for repertoire, you know, and partly is because the voice has been confined a little bit to the past, and then we're kind of stuck there because whenever we want to look at music, it's always sort of there. However, some contemporary composers have taken on themselves to start writing with more of the modern countertenor sort of in mind, right? So I was very grateful because although there are some other singers, there are some other countertenors. I'm sure you've heard some of the beautiful albums that Philip Jaruski has put out there, you know, Andrea Scholl, where they have taken a lot of the Schubert lead, or they have used a lot of French melody, including some Latin American songs recently that I was listening in one of Jaruski's albums, but that are absolutely stunning. But there's not really a lot of music that is written with the countertenor voice in mind, you know, so we are always a little desperate and always looking at what sort of suits our range in the repertoire. Sometimes we find some beautiful things. Sometimes we get comments like, that was not written for countertenor, why are you singing it, you know? However, we still sometimes decide to sing it, you know, sometimes we have to make certain adjustments here and there. But luckily for us, there has been some contemporary composers that have been doing some work in composing for the countertenor voice. And one of them is Dr. Jose Zarate, and I was very thankful that he reached out to me not too long ago, and it was over Instagram, you know, and I had no idea really about his music, and he shared these cinco nanetas with me. They basically translates to 5 little lullabies. And to me, there were two things that were beautiful. First of all, let me tell you, Dr. Jose Zarate is quite an important figure in the Spanish music area. You know, he teaches and performs all around. He has many compositions now, I learned, you know, symphonic works, chamber works, a lot of music for piano, and some vocal music. And I was very thankful that he reached out and he shared with me his cinco nanetas. And one of the things that, for countertenor and piano, one of the things that I also found very unique is the way that he takes the countertenor voice and rather than separates it and tries to put it in this other world, as we said before, he now uses the voice to voice a father in these songs, you know, which to me was very special. And he's using sort of the tenderness and the sound of the voice to sing these cradle songs, these lullabies to his children. So with these songs, he uses 5 different dialects of Spanish. So each one, you know, has its own sort of challenges, its own colors, the different vowels, the different consonants. But nonetheless, they are very, very beautiful. They show this sort of cultural nuance from one to the other. You will be able to hear mostly on the countertenor the melodic line, sort of the lullaby line, while the piano usually carries that kind of rocking motion, you know, of rocking the baby. So again, I don't want to take too much time, but I would love to perform these pieces for you. One note that I may just add to before I do this performance is that similarly to Gabriela Lina Frank, you know, Dr. Zarate gives the performer that agency. He not only sort of reached out to me and gave me this beautiful music for performance, which I am not 100% sure, but it may be the first time they are performing in Canada as a whole set. And it's not only the fact that he approached me, but that when I asked and I said, well, is there any performer notes? Is there something that I need to know about how this should be performed? His answer was, make them yours. And I find that very, very special because it's, again, talking about that agency that composers are now given also performers, you know, and in this case, Dr. Zarate is giving me to sort of make them my own, you know, some of his beautiful compositions. So I hope you'll enjoy these cinco nanetas, 5 little lullabies. Thank you so much. And to finish today, I would like to perform one piece for you that was commissioned by the Gabriela Lina Frank Academy of Music for myself, and Timothy Peterson, who is a great American up-and-coming composer. He's written a lot for the LA Chamber Orchestra. Recently, his music was performed at the Lincoln Center. So he's an up-and-coming composer, and he was a fellow student with Gabriela Lina Frank. And he was commissioned this set of songs for me for part of the Composing Earth sort of program that was to bring awareness to the whole global warming and climate emergency that we live in right now. And part of the reason why I chose to finish the program with it's because in the song, which uses poetry, sorry, it escaped me a little bit. The poetry of Shantan's Tales from the Inner City. He describes these snails, these gigantic snails coming into a city and showing off their love and their intersections, and how these sort of like created a lot of outrage with people who call them unnatural, and why are they doing this? And then 100 years later, they are saying how they are now being really cherished, and we don't know what we would do if they weren't here, if we had kept our small ideas about love. So I am using it as a bit of a metaphor to how the countertenor also has lived, and has evolved, from originally a high voice, in the castrati when it was appreciated and it was admired, to when it disappeared from the operatic stages, and then with the emergence of the countertenor a bit confined to the past, and also with people not necessarily accepting, a lot of them being putting a little resistant to the voice. However, we've evolved a lot, and it's great that now composers are finding this voice more interesting and more and human, just as it should be, and incorporated into regular characters. We again have to thank Britain for bringing the voice onto the operatic stage, but perhaps putting it in this archetype where it didn't belong to human nature, to now composers like Zarate, who are bringing them very much and using it very much to emote like very human and very real emotions. So this song, like I said, mentions the snails, the society, the change, the acceptance, and the love. And in this last piece, the countertenor voice now then functions as a narrator, a narrator of this story. And I would like to, again, bring the attention to the fact that we've gone from, the place where we needed to fit the countertenor voice somewhere where its difference wasn't going to cause necessarily outrage, to now a place where the voice can just exist, and it can become the person that narrates this beautiful text. And in the same way, like going from what I mentioned, the archetype to the embodiment to intimacy to now the reflection. And similarly to Britain, Timothy Peterson has a voice in mind, because in this case he was writing for me and we had the chance to collaborate when he was starting to write this piece. However, he's also writing now for a whole group of singers, for a tessitura, and he's like giving us more of this repertoire that countertenors are craving and are wanting to be able to perform. And of course he's doing it not just with my voice in mind, but with the awareness that all these different voices are very, very, even though we're countertenors, each voice has its own qualities. So to leave you with this last piece, I would like to ask Joel again to come back to perform this beautiful piece by Timothy Peterson called Snail, from a set of songs called Three Encounters.
Even 100 years old. And who can remember what all the fuss was about? I can now imagine our cities without these beautiful creatures. We would be so sad if they ever went away, leaving us all alone with our small ideas about love.
Thank you so much. So I hope that tonight, across the works, you can trace the evolution of how the countertenor voice has been utilized, from Britain's establishment of another worldly archetype, to Gabriela Nina Frank's fully embodied and performative character, to Sarate's intimate and expressive art song, and finally to Peterson's reflective and narrative writing. The countertenor moves from representation to expression. It is no longer defined by its difference, but by its capacity for communication. And perhaps the most significant shift is this: composers, performers, and listeners are no longer asking what the countertenor represents. They are asking what it can do. And the answer increasingly is that it can do anything. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Simone.